I'm lucky enough to call our next reader my friend. I first met her at like 9 o'clock in the morning at a workshop during Austin International Poetry Festival. And ever since then, that was in April, and ever since then we just kind of keep showing up in each other's lives. We're in a fiction class together this semester, and I sit right next to her, and we've both really just gone through something in this fiction class. It's been very demanding, and it's been nice to have a partner to go through that with. Paula is the winner of the 2014 Undergraduate Nonfiction Award for the Texas Association of Creative Writing Teachers. Her short fiction and poetry appear in the Rio Review and the Concho Review. I couldn't read my handwriting. And she's amazing, and I'm so blessed to be able to present you with the opportunity to hear her read. So everyone, Paula Starche.
Thank you. That was a great reading, Jessie. And I think I'm in Wade's 5th critique group.
Yeah, you are. That's right.
And I love this venue. I've been at Bookwoman a lot, and I've never read here, and this is wonderful. I've really enjoyed this. I don't know if you know, but I was asked to fill in, so I've had 24 hours to think about this, and it's been really exciting because I've written a lot of poetry and some stories about West Texas, which is where I grew up. And my husband and I just came back from the Davis Mountains this week. And it's interesting. The short story I'm going to read was published in the Concho River Review, which is out of San Angelo. And it is a true story. I mean, it's fiction, but all of the action in the story actually happened. It didn't happen, the characters have been changed, so there's some differences. I want to just read a little bit about something that Elmer Kelton said about the drought of the 50s. He wrote a book called The Time It Never Rained, and he said that rugged people, you had to be rugged to grow up west of the 98th meridian. And I asked my husband before I came over here, we're on the 97th meridian, so we're hanging in there. And anyway, he asked his father at the age of 75 how many good years of rain he'd seen, and he said 4. Those were 1906, 1919, 1941, and 1957. And the story I'm going to read that I wrote is about the drought of the 50s, which is not the worst drought that we've ever had, but it's the longest drought that we had. And I don't think I have time, but there's a prayer that the Livestock Weekly, this prayer was first printed in Kansas in 1935. It's a prayer for rain. Mm-hmm. And it worked. And it was printed, it's been printed a couple of times in the Livestock Weekly, and every time there's been rain. And I want to say that our rainy May this year was preceded by this being printed. So if any of you want to read it and send it to someone in California, that'd be great. Wade and AR asked me just to say a little bit about the craft issue with this. This story was written my first semester at ACC in Joe Hoppy's class, and he and Elmer Leonard had a lot of influence on this story. He said he saw something in it, and I guess sometimes you just really luck out when it comes to a teacher. He saw something in it. He said, the tone of this story is of West Texas, and you should submit it to the Concho Review. So, you know, I could have submitted it to 40 places that didn't take it, but I don't know if any of you have been in West Texas, but it's a different kind of vocabulary and style. Now, the other thing I want to say is that One of the most fun things about writing fiction is you can make things turn out like you like them. And that's what I did with this story. I made the ending turn out the way I wished it had, not the way it had. Airborne. Roy turned 13 and I turned 11 the year the floods came. In addition to managing the ranch, Dad had to add a second job working for the oil company, checking pumps and registering the production levels. The land was parched, and black tabosa grass clung to the dirt where it could. With biblical drama, it had not rained in 7 years. Elmer Kelton wrote a book about this named The Time It Never Rained. Big dust storms blew in from the northwest, making the sky brown and leaving sand inside the windowsills and in our throats. The cowboys on the ranch covered their mouths with their bandanas. Inside, Roy and I and our younger brothers watched John Wayne stand off all the rustlers. The house nestled at the base of Monument Hill, so named for an Indian mound at its top. Snakes, rabies, and scorpions were our natural enemies, but the odds were with us and we prevailed. After all, we had our father, good with a shotgun and a shovel and not afraid. One evening we had a rabid fox at the back door. "Bring me the gun, Frankie," yelled Dad, and I ran like the wind. At night he fortified himself with pearl beer. I haven't said anything about our mother. She was a nervous type, but she was right there cooking, changing a diaper, and if possible reading a book. In the morning she made me stay still while she braided my hair, or auburn hair. Afterwards, I helped her wash the cloth diapers and hang them in the yard. "Frankie, put your fingers between the soft skin and the diaper," she said, showing me how to guide the safety pin through the tough cloth without puncturing the baby. She taught me how to pour the condensed milk into the sterilized bottles and feed the baby in the early morning. In the evenings, Mom would read to us and tell stories of growing up in Chicago, a place where there were movie theaters and candy stores. At night, she fingered her silver-beaded rosary as she went to sleep. As soon as we were 7 or 8 and could sit on a horse, we would ride with Dad and the other cowboys to help with the roundups. The orange-pink sun announced the day's arrival as the horses were saddled. It was a source of pride to have legs long enough to swing up into the saddle without a helping hand from one of the men. That was the year the stirrups were lowered on my saddle and I moved up to a bigger horse named Pepper. Some mornings we rode over the railroad tracks to the middle pasture. On windy days, tumbleweeds, just as in the movies, would sweep across the roads and pasture. My brothers and I could contain the sheep once the cowboys had them gathered. When we rode back, we held tightly to the reins to keep the horses from bolting for the barn. Otherwise, we would be on a runaway and likely thrown. In the evenings, we heard our parents talking about the drought and fretting about how to find money for school clothes. My father thought Mom spent too much money, so we felt guilty about the things we had. We kept quiet about shoes that pinched or flapped. If it would only rain, we knew we would be all right. It was affording the feed for the cattle that was worrying Dad and causing their arguments at night. There was a dry creek bed 100 yards in front of the ranch house. A great blue heron came through that spring and stood majestically in the draw, an omen of promise. The bird possessed the draw even more than the red-tailed hawks that flew overhead. One weekend, our uncle brought his small plane out to the ranch. "Who wants to go up for a ride?" he asked. He brought a kite with him, and it seemed to rise up into the clouds. I confused the two events, and I believed I had traveled up to the top of the kite. One week in early October, the rain began. We ran outdoors in our bare feet, chilly but energized by the water dripping down our faces, licking the drops. Roy found the slippery baby frogs first. He handed one to me in his cupped hands as a present. I made a soft cave for it in my palms and felt the tickle of its little feet. My mother was behind us holding my youngest brother in her arms, and all of us were drenched and yelping with joy. When my father arrived in his truck, we went inside, leaving the doors and windows open for the evening. I kept the little frog in a jar by my bed and let it go the next morning. Our good mood lasted through the next day, even better because Dad had to stay home from work. When he went out to check the draw, he found the water level too high to cross in his pickup. Not even the school bus could cross. It was a perfect day for hopping in puddles and counting baby frogs. Drowned ants floated by in little rivulets. We had never even seen an umbrella. Dust in and out of the house was replaced with mud. Sam and Joe wrestled with each other in the living room until Dad shouted to them to quit that noise and raised a ruckus itself. Later, the second youngest, John, slipped out the door in his diaper and was up at the corral before anyone noticed. That evening, the phone line went down in the rain. We heard the rain through the night and our hopes were high. There would be grass for the livestock and continued ranch work for Dad. We would run barefoot in the cool grass of the yard. The next morning, I curled up with Sam to read Charlotte's Web aloud. I felt an urge to look out the front door. Dirty brown water swirled up against the bottom edge of the door sill. We were flooded and we were marooned. Dad and Mom gathered up the youngest in their arms and we waded the 50 yards to the corral. Turning right out the back gate, we climbed up the path to the hill. Once we were on higher ground, Dad and Roy went back for the station wagon and truck and drove them up on the hill. The two of them went back down to save as much of our clothing and furniture as possible, and the rest of us watched their movements from the car. Roy was tall for his age and very strong, but the water was rising. So Dad put him on the most solid horse, Honey, and Dad stayed afoot. Mom was worried and wanted them to come back up, but I felt sure they could manage. I felt guilty for not being with them. Dad said I was the best of all of us on horseback and I could be helping. I was wondering how the sheep were faring when I noticed that Roy had headed Honey down in the direction of the draw. What on earth was he doing? I could see that Dad was yelling at him, but Roy couldn't hear. Then I saw his objective. A sheep had become tangled in the mesquite and bee brush along the road, and he had set out to free it before it drowned. As he reached the sheep and leaned down out of the saddle to pull at the branches, Honey panicked and tossed Roy into the water. He reached for a thick branch, but the water whirled around him and sucked him down toward the rising creek. Our father grabbed a long rope from the fence post of the corral and waded desperately in Roy's direction. He reached the horse and swung onto the saddle. We lost sight of all three of them within a few minutes. This was the first, but not the last time in my life that my mind expressed no thought at all in a crisis. Almost everyone in the car was crying or yelling, but I had a sense of complete silence. Both the worst and nothing at all had happened. It was Sam who shook me. There's a radio in the truck, Frankie. Our closest neighbor was 3 miles away with a muddy back road for access, but we could try. Sam had played with the radio behind Dad's back, so we knew how to work it. Our neighbor answered that he was headed our way and would leave his wife at their house to call the nearest town for help. It was about noon when our neighbor and Dad walked up the hill without Roy. A quick call to our neighbor's wife gave us little information, but she had spoken with the sheriff in our county. We had no food or water, so the neighbor went back for his wagon and some supplies. As he left, his wife's voice came over the radio. There was a chance that a helicopter en route back to Goodfellow Air Force Base could look for Roy. It was getting later in the day, but the helicopter was less than an hour away. We heard it before we saw it, of course. The rotors made the same noise as on whirlybirds, but I did not feel the confidence I had in the TV heroes. Dad waved them in the suspected direction of Roy from the ground, while our neighbor tried to maintain radio contact. The flow of the water would have been obvious from the air, and the helicopter began moving back and forth as it went down Spring Creek. It disappeared from sight. Our neighbor had brought provisions so we children could eat, but the grown-ups had no interest in food. About 4 o'clock, as the late afternoon light began to change, we were radioed that Roy had been sighted. He was high in an oak tree near the fence line at the road. He had been swept into a whirling area which broke the water's force just enough for him to climb up into the tree's branches. 30 or so minutes later, we received the news that they had successfully lowered and raised the rescue ropes and that he was in the helicopter. It was not safe to land, and they were taking him to Goodfellow. They passed back over us as they left the ranch. There were tears all around. "I wish I had a pearl," said Dad, but it was long gone. The ground was impassable for a car, but we had enough light to make it to the neighbor's house by horse-drawn wagon. The next morning, we learned the floodwaters had peaked at 4 feet in our house. That was our first flood. The next one was in April, and the third was the following September. Neither of these reached the house. Dad was able to quit his second job, and we had an extra cowhand graduated from short pants to ride on the roundups. By then, my legs were long and the grass was tall, waving to the blue, cloudless sky. Thank you.